Thank you all for coming too. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to you this morning about the linkages of London and slavery, and within that about new work that's underway at UCL that examines some of those linkages in particular. My title, as Stephen said, is What Does London Owe to Slavery? And as you'd recognize, there's at least a deliberate ambiguity in terms of the title. On the one hand, it means to what extent is the development, or was the development of London into a world city and the center of, the financial center of global capitalism, a function of its involvement in slavery. That's clearly a question about the past, and it's a question that should be dealt with perhaps most appropriately by academic historians. There's also embedded in the question a second meaning, the implication that there is potentially a debt to be paid, that there's an obligation arising from London's involvement in slavery historically. And that raises, of course, the questions of from whom and to whom. Those are not questions that academic historians can settle. Those questions belong to us all. Now, there's clearly a connection between the first meaning of the question, the empirical background, and then the second, which is the so what. And logically and chronologically, the first question, the first inflection on the question should precede the second. So London's past is relevant to its present. That's not confined, obviously, to this issue in history. It's one of the reasons why we study history in the first place. But the connections in this particular case seem to me to be more difficult, more contentious, potentially more controversial. And so it's important that, as Stephen signaled, I will try and confine my talk to about 30 minutes and then give an opportunity to the floor for contributions and questions arising not only from the first meaning, which is where I'm going to focus, but from the second meaning, which is the so what. What academic historians can do in this context is to contribute data. And what I'm going to be talking about is to describe the work underway under the banner of Legacies of British Slave Ownership, which is intended to provide data. Now, data is slightly unfashionable in terms of history today, academic history today. But what we're doing is attempting to provide both facts and also frameworks or proposed frameworks within which those facts can be evaluated and assessed. I should also say at the outset that the intention is that we make the work that we're doing fully publicly available at the end of the project in ways that I'll come on to describe. Before talking particularly about the project itself, though, I need to set just a little bit of context. And for those of you in the audience who already know this stuff, forgive me, but I think it's important that everybody is on the same basis of knowledge. When we talk about Britain and slavery or London and slavery, what we're talking about is colonial slavery. And by that I mean that slavery, chattel slavery as a social institution, is never embedded in Britain itself, in metropolitan Britain itself. Britain came late to the slavery business. When it came, it was very enthusiastic in its embrace of slavery. But the slave system was established effectively by the Portuguese as early as the mid-15th century. Even before the discovery of the New World by Europeans, there was a slave sugar complex established by the Portuguese in Madeira, and the slave trade was up and running. So Britain steps into an existing system when it begins to colonize or to seize its own colonies in the New World from 1607 Virginia, 1623 St. Kitts onwards. And as I say, Britain becomes a very enthusiastic participant in the slave trade and in slavery. It continues to increase the size of its slave empire all the way through the 18th century. In 1763, as part of the settlement after a war with France, Britain seizes a whole load of new territories, and in the Napoleonic Wars, at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, Britain does it again and takes again a whole new series of colonies from France and its allies, including Mauritius, the Cape of Good Hope, British Guiana, Trinidad. These are significant expansions of Britain's slave frontier at a time, as some of you know, when Britain is actually coming close to abolishing participation in the slave trade itself. In 1807, the slave trade, Britain's participation in the slave trade, is prohibited by Act of Parliament. Slavery itself, importantly, continues. Okay, the social institution of slavery is not abolished until in 1833, an act is passed in Parliament, the Abolition Act, which, amongst other things, provides for a period of apprenticeship for the enslaved who remain in bondage, coerced labor until 1838. Now, this period that I'm sketching out, obviously, from the 17th century to the early 19th century, coincides, of course, with the changes in Britain that we associate with the Industrial Revolution. The transformation of British life through urbanization, through the automation of production, the arrival of Britain as the first industrial power. It also coincides with the emergence of London as the world's leading financial centre. London has always been a very significant city, obviously, in the context of the UK, initially of England, then of Great Britain, then of the United Kingdom. And it dominates British life in many of the ways it still does today. And that's a function of Britain concentrating a lot of its processes into London. The courts here, as in the Royal Court, it's the seat of government, it's the seat of law, it's also the main port for many years alongside the Thames. And those things come together to create a hotspot, a world city. Within that, the emergence of Britain as a financial centre is a function, or London as a financial centre, is really a function of the 18th century, i.e. the very period in which we're most active in the slave trade. In the 18th century, Britain ships 2.5 million enslaved Africans from the west coast of Africa to the Atlantic colonies, not only our own, but also those of other European powers. And within that, London itself accounts for about 700,000. And when I say London itself, I mean that ships that leave from London, that are owned by London merchants, and the voyages are operated by London slave traders, and the ships tend to return to London at the end of the triangular trade that they're embarked in. So the coincidence, or there's a convergence of three things at the same time: slavery, the Industrial Revolution, and London's emergence as the dominant financial centre as it becomes by the early 19th century, not only for Britain, but for Europe and for the world as a whole. We can't simply say that these changes were caused by Britain's involvement in slavery. Of course we can't. If slavery were a sufficient condition, slave trade were a sufficient condition of industrialization, Portugal and Spain would have gone first, and they didn't. So it's a function of a lot of other different forces that come together at the same time. The commercialization of agriculture, imperial expansion in the east, as well as into the Atlantic world, the enclosure movement, the transformation of technology. So a lot of things come together, and the challenge is to isolate within this slavery's impact and analyze slavery as a component part of a much broader set of forces. Now, we're obviously not the first scholars to begin to puzzle about this connection. 70 years ago, a man called Eric Williams wrote a very brilliant book called Capitalism and Slavery, which sets out the thesis that the Industrial Revolution in Britain is intimately connected with Britain's participation in the Atlantic slave system. And although his arguments since then have been pushed backwards and forwards, he still defines the landscape in which everybody who's researching and thinking about slavery in Britain works, either in opposition to Williams or more consistently with him. And recent scholarship, particularly two books, there's a book very recently published by Nuala Zahadia about London in the late 17th century. She argues that London's participation in the Atlantic trade with the colonies in the Atlantic, which in many cases are slave colonies, not exclusively, but in many cases are slave colonies, she sees that as being a critical period in London's leap up the world table in terms of its financial, its status as a financial centre. And a few years prior to that, Joseph Inikari wrote a book called Africans in the Industrial Revolution, which makes a very sophisticated version of Williams' case that the combination of the commercialization of agriculture in Britain and Britain's participation in the slave trade and the slave economy of the Atlantic world are the two forces that come together to create this unique industrial revolution. So in doing the work that we're doing, we're not running entirely against the grain of current scholarship. I think that's important just to register that. The project that we're embarked on, as I said, is called The Legacies of British Slave Ownership. It's run by Professor Catherine Hall, includes myself, and Keith McClelland, who has a political history background. We're funded by the ESRC. And what we're doing is looking at the entire corpus of people in Britain who owned slaves at the end of slavery. When slavery was abolished through the 1833 Abolition Act, one of the provisions was that compensation would be paid to the slave owners. Okay? The British state is buying the freedom of the enslaved from the slave owners in a very elaborate financial operation that throws up the need, of course, to identify all the slave owners, and they want to be identified because there's money at stake, and so they step forward and make claims on the British state, and in exchange they're paid not the whole value of their slaves, but part of the value of their slaves, and they're cashed out of slavery. There's no financial provision made for the enslaved, which you may or may not be surprised to learn. And what we're doing is taking these records that are generated by the compensation process and analyzing who are the slave owners in Britain. Clearly, many slave owners are in Barbados or Jamaica, St. Kitts. They live and work with the enslaved. But there is a corpus of people, very significant people, who live in Britain and own slaves as absentee landlords. They're miles away from the reality of slavery, but financially they're benefiting from slavery, and of course they are active politically in defense of slavery in Britain. And there's a corpus of around 2,500 to 3,000 slave owners in Britain who own about half of the total number of enslaved. So it's a small number of slave owners relative to the total number of slave owners, but they're very significant slave owners. They own, as I say, half the enslaved. And there are, as again many of you know, in excess of 600,000 enslaved in the Caribbean at this point. This is a lot of people. Of those 2,500 to 3,000, you would expect wealth brings power. They tend to be members of the elites in Britain. And for every subset of the elites that we've looked at so far, whether it's MPs, members of baronets, sheriffs of counties, those traditional badges of elite status, around 5 to 10% of those people are in the slave compensation records. And we can debate afterwards, if you want, whether 5 or 10% is a big or a small number, but that is the number. It's a consistent pattern that comes back. Of those slave owners, almost half are linked to London, in the sense that they have recognizable addresses in London. And of course, some of them have places in the country as well. London, because of the nature of its infrastructure, attracts a season, people who come for the sitting of Parliament originally and then who come for social reasons. So we're not suggesting that these people are, in every case, permanently resident in London. But there is a significant bulk of these people who are connected to London. And what I want to do is to explore, using this rather, I think, wonderful map. This was created by Rachel Evans, who's our project administrator, who's currently on maternity leave. And it shows, as you can see, the area in which you're sitting now. Okay, this is Fitzroy Via. Rachel did this map, stimulated by an independent researcher called Christiana Dankwa, who's doing some work on Fitzroy Via. And in response to the approach from Christiana about this area, we did the work to look at who lived and worked in this area where we are. You can see more clearly from here. This is where we are. This is where you're sitting at the moment, along here where the University of London is, on Gower Street. And the pins are slave owners. These are houses that we've identified and linked to slave owners in the 1830s. And there are, I think altogether, there are about 6 dozen slave owners in this area. And as I say, this spans already a 10-year period. People who are living here at any point in the 1830s were picked up. So it's not that they walk down the street and every house would be occupied at the same time by the same people. And I'm going to use 4 or 5 examples from here to highlight a number of things that seem to us to be important about London and slavery. Let me start off with the first one. This is going to be John Adams Wood. Lives in Woburn Place. John Adams Wood is a name that may be familiar to some of you. He is the owner of Mary Prince. And Mary Prince is the author mediated by her white sponsors. But Mary Prince is an enslaved woman who's brought to London in the late 1820s by John Adams Wood. And in Britain, her status changes. She is effectively a servant rather than an enslaved person. But her freedom is confined. She cannot go home, which is where she wants to go. She's married. She cannot leave Britain without being re-enslaved. And so she's trapped in this extraordinary world. She leaves the house, she leaves John Adams Wood's house, and is originally helped by a very poor couple who take her in. She's then found effectively by the abolitionists. They take her up. It becomes a cause célèbre. They transcribe her life story. And that life story is an extraordinary life story, inevitably. Given the patterns of mobility, the disruption to her family or any family linkages are completely overwhelmed by slavery, because the decision about where you go and what you do is not in your own hands, it's in the hands of somebody else. So the lack of autonomy that she has in the basic decisions in her life, and then the space she tries to create within that, these are all very important signals from slavery. Of course, it is mediated as a narrative. And my point in bringing forward John Adams Wood is not only the kind of the curiosity value of him living just around the corner from here, but to emphasize that one of the things that our project is not about is about the black presence in London or about the experience of the enslaved. Not because that work is not important, it's obviously extremely important, but there are other people who are better equipped to carry it forward, and we're doing a different project. But there's work being done, as again, some of you know, by Karen Bress in the geography department here. There's a new book by Kathy Tate about the black presence in Britain in this period. There is good work being done. We're focused on the John Adams Woods of the world. And the second reason for raising it is really that it's striking that despite the hostility that's generated around the libel cases that devolve from Mary Prince's narrative and the challenge to it, that John Adams Wood is still able to live in London comfortably enough, right? He's not, as far as we can see, under any social pressure in London. London's a big city and he's taken up and absorbed by it, and he doesn't fear for his safety as he walks down the street. He is a normal member of the community, and he's a slave owner. Okay. Second exemplary case is David Hall in Portland Place, then and I guess now a more upmarket part of this area, just on the west end of it. Hall is was a member of a slave-owning family in Barbados. Since we put this together, we've now confirmed that it's the same David Hall. By the 1830s, though, he was a partner in a merchant firm called Hall McGarrell. You will never have heard of it. There's no reason why you should. But they are one of about 150 merchant firms in Britain, in London, who take slave compensation in this process in the 1830s. And merchants are involved because they have conventionally lent money to the planters as part of their business relationship. They act as agents for the planters in Britain. They buy supplies. They finance the purchase of slaves when it was possible to buy slaves. And they build up credit balances with the planters owing them money. And at various points, the merchants step in and secure their exposure, their financial exposure on the estates and on the bodies of the enslaved, on the enslaved themselves. So when compensation rolls around, the merchants are in the queue for money. And as I say, there are about 150 merchant firms involved. Now, is 150 a lot or few? It seems like a lot in isolation, but there are more than 5,000 merchant-type firms in the City of London at this point. So it's a small number numerically. It's 3% or so. But these firms tend to be bigger firms, better capitalized because of the credit-intensive nature of their business, and that wealth brings them power within the city. And I'll come back to that in a moment. The Hall McGarrell firm today has no resonance. It's disappeared. Hall himself, when he died in 1842, shortly after the compensation process, left £200,000 in effectively non-landed real estate, what is called personalty. That made him one of the very richest people in Britain who died in that year. His partner, a man called Charles McGarrell, lived much longer. And McGarrell sponsors his son-in-law, his brother-in-law, who's a generation younger than him, called Quintin Hogg, into the firm of Hall McGarrell and successor firms after emancipation. So Quintin Hogg is a young man. He doesn't leave Eton, I think, until the 1860s. But he's taken up by McGarrell and made a rich man through his involvement in British Guiana in sugar production after emancipation. And Quintin Hogg, as you may recognize, founds his own political dynasty. We've had two Lord Chancellors in the past century from this family, again, both called Quintin Hogg, the first Viscount Hailsham and the second Lord Hailsham, who served under Thatcher and under Ted Heath as Lord Chancellor. The most recent member of this dynasty is Douglas Hogg, whose moat cleaning we all paid for relatively recently. And until Douglas Hogg, all of the members of this family carried the McGarrell name. Okay, so the name of this slave owner was embedded in the heart of the Tory party for 150 years, effectively, by this strange dynastic quirk of McGarrell effectively adopting his brother-in-law. Third up. This is Benjamin Greene. He's a brewer, originally from Bury St Edmunds. He's the Greene in Greene King, which still exists, I think, now as pub owners rather than brewers. And he was a violent pro-slavery advocate. He was a slave owner in St Kitts, and he managed estates for other slave owners in this rather odd nexus of Suffolk gentry who owned enslaved people. He left Bury St Edmunds out of the social tensions that arose in that town from abolition and slavery, the contestation, and came to London in the late 1830s. His son, a man called Benjamin Butt Greene, goes to St Kitts in the late 1820s to manage the family estates and manage them into this compensation process. And Benjamin Butt Greene's formative years are spent in the Caribbean running slave estates. Butt Greene comes back, joins his father for a period in merchant business, and then sets up on his own with new partners and prospers, and becomes governor of the Bank of England. And he is by no means the only governor of the Bank of England who's embroiled in the slave economy. Between 1807, the abolition of the slave trade, and 1834, the abolition of slavery itself, there are, I think, 14 governors of the Bank of England, because they served 2 years, terms of 2 years at that point. Half of those are in the slave compensation records in some shape or form. And after the end of slavery, those traditions continue. In Victoria's reign, from about 1837 onwards, there are 33 governors of the Bank of England, and 10 of those are either recipients of slave compensation themselves, or they are the sons of, not daughters at that point, clearly. They are the sons of slave owners. So the top of the banking system is, again, imbricated with slavery. A couple more and then we'll move on and forward. John Hobson Forbes is a prominent lawyer in London, and again I highlight him because this is a period in London in the 1830s when the professions are getting going. Accounting, legal firms are being established that become part and parcel of London's prosperity because they provide services to the entirety of Britain and to some extent globally. And Hobson Forbes is one of these men. He's acting for slave owners, and he is a trustee or an executor in about a dozen claims altogether that we've found. So he's intimately involved in the slave-owning business of his clients. You may say, of course he is. That's what lawyers do. They follow their clients. But there are some law firms who are active in this period, who are visibly not in the slave compensation process. One in particular, Ashurst Morris Crisp, is founded in this period and appears to have taken a principled decision not to be part and parcel of this system. Freshfields, which still exists today as a very successful law firm, one of the largest in Europe, took a different decision, and James William Freshfield and his partners, again, are embroiled in a whole number of claims here on behalf of slave owners. And finally, on this map, I just wanted to finish up with a slightly different type of example. This is Harry Barker at 150 Tottenham Court Road. The people I've talked about so far, obviously, are members of the elite in Britain and in London. They're either they're the upper middle class, and there's a whole bunch of aristocratic claimants as well, whom we haven't dwelt on here, because they tend not to live in this area. Okay, the aristocrats are somewhere slightly down the road. But Harry Barker owns 2 enslaved people in St Vincent, and with his wife. It's not clear to us what the path to ownership is, but he writes to the commissioners of slave compensation to say, I'm going to go out to St Vincent and pursue my claims. So it's only 2 people whom he owns, it's only 2 people. And yet the amount of money is material enough to him for him to be contemplating taking a voyage, which is not straightforward, to press his claims. So there is, as well as the elite, there is a tier of people, 1,000 or so, we think, in Britain, who own small numbers of slaves. They tend to be widows and orphans, and this is how they support themselves. Okay. Just as an aside, really on Fitzroy Via, I think it's important to recognize that, of course, the density that you see here is not typical of London as a whole. It's certainly typical of this area. If you go west from here along Marylebone Road towards the Westway, particularly to the south as you go west, the area around Harley Street, Wimpole Street is denser even than this pattern in terms of slave owners. This is where the West Indians come to live and to be. In the suburbs, of course, it's a much thinner presence. But almost everywhere that you turn on the peripheries of London, you will find houses that belong to or were built by slave owners. But they are thinly spread. It's not a density like this. So the Fitzroy Via map is telling us something about the presence of slave wealth in the northern expansion of these new genteel areas in and around this period. And I think from my description, it also should have told you something about the city of London and how that's being impacted by slavery in this period. But of course, there are other characteristics of these people that we need to think about as well. Where else did they put their money? One obvious place is the railways. The railway boom was underway at the same time as the slave compensation money was coming in. And it's possible to look at least more or less simultaneous arrivals of slave compensation money and departures in terms of investments in new railway companies. And Charles McGarrell, for example, whom I mentioned, invested just under £100,000, a very significant amount of money by the standards of the day, in a series of railway schemes, many of which were to do with binding London together and binding it to the hinterland in North Kent and the south coast and so on. We're also tracking the slave owners in terms of connoisseurship and collections. Okay? Again, they're wealthy people. They tend to participate in the accumulation of physical stuff from particularly southern Europe that takes place in this period as Britain raids the old aristocratic families of Europe, brought low by the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolution, and just aggregates a whole load of things, paintings, curios, objets in Britain. And so again, what we're trying to do is track how these accumulations of stuff by slave owners come together and then how they're dispersed. And of course, because of the wealth that's involved, slavery seeps into many, many institutions. There's livery companies in the city, for example. We haven't done systematic work, but there clearly are masters of the Goldsmiths Company or prime wardens of the Goldsmiths Company, the Mercers Company, the very senior elite companies who are slave owners. So the money flows as one would expect it to do. In the context of UCL, we haven't done the work on the subscribers for UCL to pick up whether there is any significant concentration of slave ownership there, but we would not expect there to be. UCL, as many of you know, is founded effectively by a nonconformist tradition which is trying to escape from the lock that the Church of England has on higher education. King's College London, again, as some of you know, is founded in response to the foundation of UCL. It's founded by the Anglican establishment to counteract this kind of godless institution in Gower Street. And in the subscription lists for King's College London, there are a significant number of slave owners who are subscribers who fund the development of King's College. About 10% of the subscribers that we've found so far are slave owners. What that tells you, of course, is that 90% are not. And that's really where I want to come to as I begin to wind up here. London, I think, is at the beginning of confronting its roles in slavery. If you go to Liverpool, you can sense that people there are sated with the history of the slave trade and the history of the city. There's an impatience to get on and to talk about other things in the history of Liverpool. In Bristol, there's work being done that will effectively propel Bristol, I think, into the same trajectory as Liverpool itself. In Glasgow, this has hardly started as a process of thinking and exploration. We were there a few weeks ago, and there's a rather wonderful pamphlet that's been produced by some community activists there called It Wisney Us, which is their view about what the Scottish take is on slavery. Scots are all over the slave economy. 15 or 20% of our people, of our slave owners, are Scots. It's disproportionate to the size of the Scots population in relation to the overall British population. And in London we have started, but I think barely. For 200 years, or almost 200 years, we've celebrated in London its connections with abolition, including Westminster Abbey and the National Valhalla. It includes Wilberforce, it includes Charles James Fox, it includes Zachary Macaulay. As some of you know, there is now a memorial to victims of the slave trade in the city, in Fen Court, just off Fenchurch Street. And there is a struggle underway, which has been going now for a number of years, by an organization called Memorial 2007, to fund and place in Hyde Park itself a memorial to the victims of the slave trade. In the East End, in the docks, there is, of course, at the Museum of London in Docklands, the permanent gallery now, Slavery, Sugar, and London. And the Museum in Docklands is a very striking juxtaposition of course, new global capitalism in Canary Wharf and old global capitalism in the West India docks. And the docks transformed London. They stretched its geography and created the East End. And the West Indian docks were the pioneering institution amongst those. But, again, the West Indian trade is not the only trade that drives the development of docks. It's not the only dock that's built. And that takes me back to, I think, what is the central challenge in thinking through these issues around London and slavery. London is so large, its history is so complex, and there's so many things going on, that there are two risks, I think, in thinking and talking about London and slavery. The first is that slavery can get lost. Okay? There are very good general histories of London in which slavery does not figure at all. There's not even a mention of slavery or the slave trade as being a component part. And that clearly, we know from the work that we've done, but intuitively one knows that can't be right. But equally, it's not true to say that London is built on the blood of slaves. There are lots of processes underway that create London as it currently is, or as it became in the 19th century. And I think it's important that we can continue to put slavery and the slave trade as one of those streams in the context of the other things that are going on. And that's not to minimize its importance, but it's to contextualize its importance. So I really wanted to close with a plea. It's very easy in London to accept the received wisdom, the shorthand about institutions that are here. And there are two in particular where I think that has been the case now for a number of years. One is the National Gallery, and the second is the Tate Gallery. And in both cases, there tends to be a reflexive response to say, well, of course, those are the fruit of slavery. We know that's the case. The National Gallery falls into this category because the man whose collection formed the cornerstone of the foundation of the National Gallery, a man called John Julius Angerstein, is described as a slave owner. In fact, he wasn't a slave owner. He was the trustee of a slave estate in Grenada. But he made his money, primarily, from maritime insurance, and he was the chairman of Lloyd's. That industry, that business, is absolutely embedded in the slave trade and in slavery. Not, again, because that is the only business that insurance companies would, or insurance brokers were doing, insurers were doing in the 18th century. Of course, it's not the only business, but it's a very, very material one. Inekori says that 2/3 of the income of the insurers is down to the slave trade. I don't think that's right. I think the number is closer to 1/3, but it's still a very material component part. So Angerstein is implicated, if you like, if that's the right word, in slavery, but not as a slave owner. It's a more complicated relationship than that, and one that we need to take heed of. The Tate Gallery, again, Henry Tate is barely born when slavery is abolished in the British colonies. I think it's 11 or 12, something like that, when slavery is abolished. So he's not buying slave-produced sugar from British colonies. But I'll answer the question on my part. Is he buying sugar from Cuba and Brazil, which continue to be slave economies all the way through until the 1880s? I don't know the answer to that, but that seems to me to be a relevant question to ask at least. And secondly, there's the more elaborate argument, which says that sugar itself, the creation of a consumer society in Britain, the development of the market, which then Henry Tate can step into and exploit, is indeed a function of slavery, as of course it is. No slavery, no sugar in Britain. And therefore, the connections between the gallery between the gallery and slavery, again, become attenuated, but again, a real, as I say, what I think it's difficult to do is to try to be precise about these things. So the work that we're doing is intended to fill some of the empirical gaps in the knowledge about the connections of slavery, slave ownership in particular, to Britain and to London in particular. And as you gather, we're aiming to catalogue the legacies of slave owners. And then, as I said at the outset, what we want to do is to make this data available. We're going to create a forum, a basis on which you'll be able to access this and search it for whatever you're interested in, whether it's people, whether it's kind of art, products, whatever it is, so that other people can take this data on and do the work with it, which we think it will begin to support. I think that once we've kind of made our contribution, then, logically at least, comes the debate about the so what, the consequences that I described at the outset. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to say thanks very much, Nick. There's an absolutely fascinating presentation there that shows us that, in fact, sugar shouldn't taste as sweet as it does, among other things. I was also fascinated as well with the connections with Cuba and Brazil. And I also noticed there's a little bit of rivalry between UCL and King's. Did you notice that? But we'll leave that to one side. It might come up in the questions. I think we have about 8 minutes or so. Sorry, 3 minutes. Okay, I've been reduced. We've got 3 minutes for questions. Any questions, please? Okay, we have the microphone coming.
Hello. It's at the end of slavery when compensation was paid out. Slave traders in Africa, around the Bight of Benin, they sent a delegation to London to get compensation because, we'd smashed their slave trade. Did they get anything?
No, they didn't, and it's an important question, I think. The point is that the slave traders were banned and prohibited from conducting their business and didn't receive compensation. The slave owners were banned from their business of owning slaves and did receive compensation. And there were voices, as you say correctly, the slave traders themselves certainly said we should be compensated in 1807 for the loss of our trade. But they were unsuccessful. And I think the difference is that in the 1830s, what was being debated was real property. Okay? And even many of the abolitionists said this is regrettable, but there are property rights in the enslaved. We don't agree with it conceptually, but practically that is what it is. The enslaved are property, and it needs to be a compulsory purchase. We're going to take the enslaved away, and we need to compensate the owners for it. So nobody successfully made that case around the slave trade, that there were kind of rights in the abstract trade in 1807. So it's a very different dynamic. Yeah.
Good. We have a question at the back, sir.
Yes. My name is Caboose Lassie. I'm a PhD student at Birkbeck. You've made a couple of omissions. I don't know if it was deliberate, and a couple of not too misleading statements. For example, Britain and Europe used Caribbean slavery mainly for the production of raw materials. These raw materials did keep the industries going. In London, gin, for example, and sugar. And in fact, the refining industries, a lot of products came to the metropolis, not just England, but all over Europe, were refined and re-exported back to these territories. Another comment, which I wish you'd made at the beginning, is a clear distinction between Atlantic slavery and Arab slavery of Africa. Another comment I'd like to pile onto that is that the victims of Atlantic slavery are not dead and buried. They're the people, millions of people all over Africa who are suffering today because of what went on. And why you mentioned Tate, Mr. Sugar, and not Gladstone, father of, I think, a prime minister or so, and his sugar estates in Guyana and his instigation of indentured labor from India to keep his plantations going when the Africans refused to work.
Thank you very much. I think what we do, there's lots of ideas in there. I wonder if we could get a response straight away from Nick. Thank you very much.
Okay, I think probably there are three things that I'd pull out of that. Firstly, the point that's being made about slavery, the slave ownership, and the slave economy is absolutely right and central. Okay? Our work is to do with slave ownership, and what the point that's being made is that whole industries are built on slave produce. Okay? And that's hence the debate about sugar and refining. So again, we're not pretending to answer the question about what does London owe to slavery. What we're saying is that we're going to produce at least some dimensions of it that will help answer that question. But you can't, you're correct, answer the question, what does London owe to slavery, without thinking about the industries that are based on slave produce. So I think that's clear. The debate about Atlantic versus Arab slavery, yes, again, explicitly this paper is about Britain and colonial slavery in the Atlantic. And on to the third point, which is that the victims of slavery are still alive. In a way, that's the whole point that I was making at the outset, that there is a discussion to be had about the so whats around the work that we're doing. We understand that it goes into a discussion of reparations and restitution. Of course it does. Of course it does.
Okay, I'd like to say thanks very much again, Nick, for a very, very interesting lecture. And let's put our hands together and say very much thanks, Nick.
Okay.